listening to The Truth Tank, and I'm your host, The Tank. If this is your first time listening, a big welcome. If you're a repeat listener, welcome back. So, the day has finally come for the release of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. As you probably know by now, I'm a huge Indiana Jones fan and a Harrison Ford fan. I've been looking forward to this film for a couple of years. It hasn't been without its ups and downs or its delays. It's had a pretty turbulent production and post-production. Harrison Ford got injured on the set. There's been many delays. There's a lot of backlash over the original cuts of the film, where it tested pretty poorly, and a whole bunch of other cloak and dagger, espionage-esque type stuff going on behind the scenes, with the alleged reshoots at the start of the year, which John Williams may have let slip at the end of last year when he was doing a concert in Italy somewhere. Harrison Ford also may have let the cat out of the bag with that one during an interview several months ago. But that's all in the past, and what's done is done. You can't go back in time and you can't change it. Or can you? Even though I was excited about this film, I did have my reservations. I didn't set my expectations too high, because after all, Disney and Kathleen Kennedy are behind it. There's no George Lucas, Steven Spielberg behind it this time. It's in the hands of the Mouse and KK. James Mangold did direct the film. He's a pretty competent and a very good director. But is he the man to draw the curtain on the fifth and final installment of the Indiana Jones saga? Besides all the hype and excitement around this film, there are a couple of problems. One of them is pretty obvious, and one of the biggest problems was the over budget. This film cost over $350 million, and that was mainly because of re-editing and reshoots of the film, which blew the budget completely out of proportion. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is the most expensive and over-budget film Lucasfilm has produced. I covered that in more detail on the Indiana Jones and the Dial of Disney episodes I did a couple of months ago. And the others are Disney and Kathleen Kennedy, which, if you've listened to the podcast before, you probably know my stance on these two by now. It's been well covered in several episodes. If you haven't had a chance to listen to them, I'd recommend going back and giving them a listen. It might provide a bit more backstory. But for as much as the marketing tried to make this film look like it was a smooth Indiana Jones adventure, I had a feeling it was headed for rocky waters. Before I say any more, let's just get into tonight's episode. This is episode 50 of The Truth Tank, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny review. And it goes without saying there are spoilers ahead, so if you haven't seen the film or are wanting to see the film, I suggest turning off now. Alright, so if you're listening beyond this point, I assume that you have seen the film or you just don't care. So let's get into our Indy 5 and the Dial of Destiny review. So first up was the start of the film. It has a pretty interesting start. I like the tone and I like the pacing. The opening credits start like every other Indiana Jones film, but then they kind of disappear. I can't remember if I was just focusing on the action too much and kind of overlooked the opening credits, but the opening credits and the opening sequence in the other previous 4 Indy films have all been very theatrical and very thematic, and have always dumped you right in the action of Indiana Jones, going right back to Raiders in the 80s and having that Paramount logo disappear and turn into the mountain before Indy's silhouette steps into frame and puts us straight into the adventure. So the credits, as far as I can remember, kind of disappear halfway through. It had Harrison Ford in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, but I'm pretty sure it's just said Harrison Ford and not Harrison Ford starring in like the other previous films, which was a minor issue, but it throws off the consistency a little bit with the opening credits from the 4 previous films. The start of this film has been talked about for a while. It was a very good opening sequence. We're back to the 1940s, and we're dropped right into the action at the end of World War II, and Indy's old familiar enemy, the Nazis. It's a very nice intro. It drops you in the action like all the previous Indy films. There's a nice intro to some of the new characters, such as a very brief appearance by Thomas Kretschmann, however you pronounce his last name. It seems he always plays a Nazi in a World War II film. He was a Nazi in Valkyrie, U-571, And he's also the ship captain in Peter Jackson's King Kong. He's a very good actor. He's very underrated. I wish he would do more films. And this is where we get our first introduction to Mads Mikkelsen's villainous Vola, or Dr. Vola. Right from the get-go, Mads Mikkelsen's Vola is as sinister as any other villain in the Indiana Jones universe. When you first meet him, he is not quite the villain he comes across as later on in the film. We also get our first intro to Toby Jones's Basil Shaw, the father of Helena Shaw and Indy's friend. Toby Jones plays the part really well. He's another very underrated actor. He's not much to look at, but he has got some pretty powerful acting chops. He plays a spy, spying for the Allies against the Germans. He is caught by the Nazis and pretends he's a birdwatcher at night. So, go figure. And despite his less than impressive stature, he doesn't crack under the interrogation of Colonel Weber, played by Thomas Kretschmann. So right from the get-go, we're dropped straight into the action. There's not a moment to waste. And this is where we get our first look at the de-aged Indy, or de-aged Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones. The de-aging that we saw in the trailer looked pretty good. I was hoping they were going to work on it a bit more before the release, because the scenes with the de-aging in it are very inconsistent. Some scenes it looks fantastic, and other times you just know there's something off. And it's always the most minute details too. It's never a really big obvious flaw that throws off the de-aging. It's always something very subtle. The de-aging is mainly just the face, so I am very surprised they didn't work on it more or put a little more effort into it. And de-aging tech has improved a hell of a lot over the years, but it's 2023 and you think that they would have it down pat by now, because it's been around for a hell of a long time. It first appeared in 2010's Tron Legacy. That's the first film I can remember seeing it in, with the de-aged Jeff Bridges. It was good and believable if the face didn't move too much, but you could still tell that the face had been animated or had something done to it. And this is much the same story 12 to 13 years down the track. It's the minute details on the face that always throw it off. And going back to the previous episode I did about Avatar, this comes right down to the uncanny valley. Your eyes know they're being lied to because there's something not quite right about the face. It's always the face and the eye that gives it away. And these are the biggest flaws with the de-aged sequences. Some of the face, in particular the cheek and mouth movements, aren't quite right, and you know there's something off. So you're looking at the face saying this isn't moving properly. It kind of takes you out of the action a bit. And some of the scenes are really believable. When we first see Indy de-aged, when they pull the bag off of his head, it looks really good. It looks very believable. It looks like Harrison Ford from the 80s. And there's other times when he's moving the cheeks, the lips, and in particular the eyes, they just don't move correctly, and it completely throws off the illusion. Your eyes know there is something wrong, the movement is incorrect, and it's not really selling the illusion. And apparently, Harrison Ford did a lot of that himself. He still moves like he did in the last film and in the previous films. It's just the face that has aged mainly. He did a lot of the action himself. There's also a stunt double who did a lot of the motorbike scenes later on, who had a very highly detailed latex mask, because obviously you're not going to get Harrison Ford riding a bike at night through the rain trying to catch up with a train. So it's very impressive that Harrison Ford really only needed the face to be de-aged. He didn't need a stunt double. He still moved pretty well. And that was one of the biggest flaws with Martin Scorsese's The Irishman. De-aged Robert De Niro and Al Pacino moved like old men and not like Robert De Niro or Al Pacino in their prime. Which is funny because in that film they probably should have gone with stunt doubles with face replacement. Especially that scene when he's running up the stairs, you can really tell it's a 70-something-year-old Robert De Niro jogging upstairs and not a young man. Well, Harrison Ford, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have quite the same problem. He still moves pretty well for his age. I guess it pays to be fit and live a healthy lifestyle, especially when you do reach a certain age. So the pacing is good. The action moves along really quickly. Castle blows up. Indy escapes. Basil's held captive on a train, being interrogated by Weber. Indy has to go save his friend and stop the Nazis yet again. The train part is great. I mean, how do you not love a action sequence set on a steam train at night while it's raining at the end of World War II with Harrison Ford. It definitely gives you the feeling that you are watching an Indy film, and it seems like this could have been in one of the Spielberg films 20 years ago. And this is where we get the intro to Vola's obsession with the Dial of Destiny. I forgot to mention it before. The Dial of Destiny is brought into the film right at the start. It's in a box. Vola has it, and he wants to present it to the Führer. Weber advises him not to, claiming that the Führer wouldn't care about a useless trinket. The train is full of antiquities and valuables. After a quick chase, Indy makes his way onto the train. He's dressed as a German SS officer. He's got flak tan camouflage pants, a grey SS jacket, and he's got a helmet on. So Indy's making his way through the train cars trying to find his friend while coming across all the looted treasures and valuables and antiquities the Germans have hoarded. The Dial of Destiny has been locked in a wooden box and is in one of the train carriages. Vola is pleading with Weber to try and take control of it to present it to the Führer. Indy makes his way through the train carriages, through the bunks full of sleeping Nazis. He comes across a valuables car with two guards. He finds the Dial of Destiny. He takes it. He makes his way into the very crowded mess car full of eating, drinking, and mostly drunk German soldiers. There's also a nice mention of the Spear of Destiny, or the Spear of Longinus, the spear that pierced Christ's side. This is the real treasure that Hitler wants, and the Nazis are trying to bring it to him, but as Vola quickly explains, it's a fake. The Spear of Destiny has been mentioned in one of the Indiana Joneses. I'm pretty sure it was The Last Crusade. I should know that. So there's a nice link back to the previous films. Vola, Weber, and a bunch of other Nazis are looking for the intruder on the train. This leads to a very cool set piece involving the anti-aircraft or AA gun. And before the film came out, I was a bit skeptical about them going back to World War II and having Nazis in it again. I thought, why World War II again? Why the Nazis? Haven't we seen this twice before? But I get why they did it. It does round off the saga nicely, and it does have that communal bad guy in the Nazis. But more importantly, it works. It works on an action level, and it also works in the chronology of Indiana Jones. And it's about now that the World War II angle makes sense. It also fits with the Indy lore from the books and what is mentioned in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull with Indy working for the OSS in World War II, basically being a spy for what would later become the CIA. So now we come down to the 1960s, the present day in the story. We're introduced to an older and very different Indiana Jones. He's fallen asleep in front of the TV and is awoken by a noisy neighbour. We get a shirtless scene of Harrison Ford. He looks pretty good for his age. He's got a six-pack. He's got better abs than I do, which isn't hard, and he's still got a lot of muscle. Shirtless Indy is ripped. We're transported into the 1960s and the backdrop of the moon landing. Unfortunately, it's not really mentioned a hell of a lot. We know the moon landing has happened, and there's this whole backstory to the space race, but I did want a little bit more to it because it seems a little rushed, and it was interesting because you have the older Indiana Jones who's coming to terms with a world that doesn't give a shit about the past or archaeology and is only interested in the technological future and what that might bring. You know, humans is now walking on the moon, anything is possible. And you get the feeling that Indiana Jones just doesn't give a shit about the future. He's teaching a class and no one is interested. Everyone's falling asleep. The class is more interested in the ticker tape moon landing parade that's taking place outside. I did like this scene because it is a complete contrast to the original trilogy, going back to Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you see him teaching a packed classroom full of admiring students with that girl that's got the love you written on her eyelids and students leaving him apples on his desk. And this is brought up again in The Last Crusade, where he has to sneak off into his office because he has a bunch of students outside his door all wanting their papers graded, and he has to make a sneaky exit out the back room window. So this is a nice contrast. Fast forward 20 or so years from the end of World War II to the late 60s, and he is just irrelevant in a modern world. And this is where we get our first intro to the character of Helena Shaw. one of the most fucking irritating and obnoxious characters in the Indiana Jones franchise. She makes Willie Scott look tolerable in comparison. So not long after, Indiana Jones retires from teaching and realizes the world has moved on, and he probably should too. Helena's intro is good. I was expecting it to be a lot worse. So this brings us to the bar scene where he catches up with Helena Shaw. She is the daughter of Basil Shaw. Indy hasn't seen her since she was a teenager. She comes up with this story about completing her father's work and needing the dial to do that. She slowly cons Indy into joining this obscure adventure she wants to go on. And this sets up the next big action set piece. Re-enter Voller, or as he's known now as Dr. Voller. He's a pretty important person at this time. The story doesn't go too much into his background, which was a bit disappointing because I thought he was pretty interesting and could use a bit more of a background. Voller's been working for NASA and the US government since the end of World War II. And by the sounds of it, he's made himself pretty invaluable. He's the one that designed the rocket that went to the moon, and he's had a lot to do with the space program and designing rockets over the decades. He's got a lot of high-up presidential and government contacts, but you definitely get this sinister tone from him and the feeling that once a Nazi, always a Nazi. We're also introduced to his henchman, Clabber, played by Boyd Holbrook, and Hawk, played by the gigantic Oliver Riches. He gives a very cryptic speech to a waiter delivering his food that reveals his intentions and the fact that he is still a Nazi and he is very bitter that Germany lost the war. We also get a very strong feeling that he wants to change that fact very badly. He's on his own quest to recover the dial for himself. So now we are introduced to yet another new character, Shawnette Renee Wilson's Mason. She's a CIA agent and she's working with Voller. This part's a bit rushed. They don't really go into the connection between the CIA and Voller too much. Maybe they did and I just missed the point, or I can't remember it. There's a very confusing subplot involving Voller and the CIA that isn't gone into in much detail. Voller has his bodyguards, Clabber and Hawk. Clabber sounds like he's an American. He seems to be from the South or a Midwesterner from America who is working with a Nazi. So he's a bit confusing that he's not really gone into that much. He's like a psychopathic lapdog. And if he gives them the order, these two go off and do his bidding. So he's obviously paying them a lot of money, but there doesn't seem to be a hell of a lot of motivation besides that. It's a little confusing. So Indy and Helena are at the bar catching up. Helena convinces Indy to grab his fedora and whip and go on one last adventure. Indy takes her back to the university where they have had the Dial of Destiny in storage for a number of years. Indy took it from her father and kept it safe, even though he swore to destroy it. The baddies are hot on the tail. Indy is just retired. Clabber and Hawk gun down most of Indy's acquaintances in cold blood in front of the CIA. Mason seems a bit shocked by this, but doesn't really have a lot of power over these two. They just seem to do what they want. They've just killed two people in front of her. You get the feeling that Mason and the CIA are going along with the murders of innocent civilians. And once again, this comes back to this very confusing subplot between Voller and the CIA. The baddies find Helena and Indy in the storeroom. The CIA are tracking Helena. I'm pretty sure it's because they know she is a con artist and she is trying to steal antiquities to sell on the black market. However, once again, this isn't explained all that well. Mason's tracking Shaw. Shaw doesn't seem like that big of a danger or a flight risk. And obviously Voller's gotten wind that she's looking for the Dial of Destiny and she may know where it is. So he's working with the CIA because they've tracked her so he can find the dial. I'm putting this together in my head. I'm not sure if that is actually what was supposed to be scripted, but once again, it's a little confusing. And it's very rushed over, so we don't get much time to think because there's quite a bit of action in this film. And one thing just sets up the next action set piece, which sets up the next action set piece. And it is very vague to why the CIA are willing to help murder US citizens to try to find one British conwoman. The CIA is working with Voller. Voller is working for the president, and we also assume NASA. He built the rockets that went to the moon. This is the more or less the backstory to him. And the subplot, it's not very well defined, and I did want a bit more because I thought the space race angle was very interesting. It does fit perfectly in line with the chronology of Indiana Jones, especially from where we last see him in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So Vola's cleanup crew accompany Indy, which leads to the next action set piece, the ticker tape parade in New York, which leads to the horse chase in the subway, which is pretty good. Even if some of the CG on the face is a little dodgy, that was one of the criticisms when the first trailer came out, that the face wasn't lined up properly with the stuntman on the horse, and this is something they didn't really seem to correct that much in the film, which does give you a pretty strong indication that this film was a bit rushed in some parts. So after the subway, Indy finds himself in a bit of trouble. He is now a wanted fugitive for the murders of his co-workers. Even though Indy wasn't the one responsible for their deaths, he is being blamed and his face is all over the news. Indy's on the run for murder, which isn't really touched upon after that. Now enter the return of mine, and I assume every other Indiana Jones fan's favourite sidekick, Sulla. It's a nice reunion, although it's a bit brief. He's been living in New York for a few decades with Indy's help. Indy helped him and his family immigrate to the United States. Shaw gets away, she goes on the run. Indy's on the trail of Helena. Now we get another de-aged flashback to the past between Indy and Shaw's dad, Basil. Unfortunately, Toby Jones doesn't get a hell of a lot of screen time. He's pretty impactful with the time he has on screen, which seems to be a bit of a recurring theme with him. He doesn't get a hell of a lot of screen time in a lot of movies, despite being a very talented actor. So there's an interesting back and forth between the characters. Basil is losing his mind due to his obsession with the Dial of Destiny. Indy is concerned and takes it from him and swears to destroy it, which obviously by this point in the film we know he doesn't. We see Helena as a young girl. Indy takes the dial, he leaves the house on a pretty emotional note, but he forgets his fedora, which is a black mark against James Mangold, which I know he'd probably say there was trying to subvert the expectations, or we wanted to see the degradation of the Indiana Jones character, kind of like he did with Logan. Because Indy would never ever forget his fucking hat, ever. He gets in a car, he's about to drive away when Helena brings him his fedora, where he thanks her, calls her Wombat, and is on his merry way. Now, I get the feeling that that scene is put in there because the original idea was to have Helena take over from Indy and either pick up his fedora after he was killed off, or he retires, gives her the hat, and she follows in his footsteps. So I was a little bit annoyed by that scene. So the Dial of Destiny is in several pieces. Helena has one piece. There is, I think, 3 pieces in total. And this follows the classic MacGuffin storyline from all the Indiana Joneses and Star Wars, where you have to find an object or an artifact or a map or something, when you've got that leads to the next piece, which leads to the next piece, which leads to the grand finale or the completion of the quest, more or less. Enter the next big set piece, Tangier, and the black market auction of relics. Shaw is there trying to sell her piece of the Dial of Destiny for as much money as she can get. She is not cut from the same cloth as Indiana Jones, and that is apparently clear because Indy would never do that. She is all about the money. She is basically conned him to get access to the dial so she could steal it and sell it to pay off her gambling debts with the local mob. Now, Helena Shaw is not a likable character, and this part in particular, she is very unlikable. Her intro into the film wasn't as bad as I was expecting, but this part of the movie, she is a very different character. She's more obnoxious, a lot more annoying, and she's very arrogant. And I'm getting the feeling that the difference between her at the start of the film and about the midway point of it, and bearing in mind this is a long movie, it's 2 hours and 34 minutes or something like that, was the original Helena that we were supposed to see. I get the feeling they cut a lot of the obnoxious Helena out of the film and a lot of the snarky remarks about Indy's age, because her whole character in Tangier is fucking unlikable. She's a liar, a cheat, a con woman, and a thief. She doesn't have many characteristics that you can really say are that likable. She doesn't have very many good traits, and she just comes off like a fucking entitled bitch. And unfortunately, I think if the casting was different, this might have been a different story, because speaking just in my own opinion, I can't stand Phoebe Waller-Bridge. I don't get why she's so special and why she's always brought on board to quote-unquote improve a script or a character. Yeah, I get she's a writer and she might have had that popular show Fleabag. I haven't seen it, and I haven't heard many good things about it. That pretentious, obnoxious kind of sense of humour is fucking unlikable. She single-handedly ruined Solo. That movie was average at best, but it was worse having her as that fucking god-awful pansexual droid, L337. Best part of that film is when she gets blown apart. She was also brought on board to help improve the No Time to Die script, which didn't need improving, and you can tell that Lysandra Lynch's character was either her creation or was made even more unlikable by her writing and how she envisioned the character. And from what I hear, she did have a bit to do behind the scenes with the story, and even having James Mangold agree to take the story and her character in certain directions. I get she's a writer, but she's not a good one. She's definitely not a director. She's directed one music video that I know of called Phoebe Bridgers' Survivor Complex. Wouldn't really be my first choice of trying to quote-unquote improve a Bond script to make it less chauvinistic or sexist. James Bond is James Bond. Some characters shouldn't be fucked with. And she's the writer of Fleabag and Killing Eve. She definitely has a very strong feminist opinion, which doesn't work in Indiana Jones. She's also apparently behind the new Tomb Raider TV show, so best of luck not trying to fuck that up. In my opinion, it was an utter crime. She was cast in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny and Solo. It's pretty fucking obvious that Kathleen Kennedy and Phoebe Waller-Bridge got along like a house on fire. She's everything she wanted in a smart, strong, courageous, independent woman working in a man's entertainment world. If Kathleen was so concerned about inserting herself into these stories and characters, she should have just written the scripts herself. Because Ray and Helena come off like parodies of herself, these strong, courageous, independent characters that can't do any wrong and know it all before it happens. Ray in the Star Wars sequel trilogy and Helena Shaw in Dial of Destiny are very similar characters. Ray isn't as annoying. Ray could have been an interesting character if she was written properly, and Kathleen and Disney weren't obsessed with pushing this woke feminist propaganda in a Star Wars film and were more concerned in actually making a good story. So I can't help but think, would this movie have been a hell of a lot better if Phoebe Waller-Bridge wasn't in it? I think it would have been. She's very unlikable, very pretentious, arrogant. There is no likable qualities about her character, and especially in this part of the film, you can really tell that they were trying to hype her up as Indy's replacement. And as I said before, she doesn't really start off that annoying. Her character's a bit over the top. She's a thief, so you assume that she has some type of set of skills relating to thievery. She's read her dad's book, so she doesn't know what she's talking about. And she wants to steal the Dial of Destiny to make money out of it. But the biggest problem is she is unrelatable. Unlike Indy, she doesn't feel real. It's at this point in the film where her attitude changes and she becomes a lot more arrogant and smug. She has that smug smile on her face nearly this entire scene. And she's lecturing people about capitalism and trying to raise the bidding price to get more money for the dial. Indy comes along and says, "This is mine," yada yada yada, and it belongs in a museum. And she is just don't listen to this old man. He doesn't know what he's talking about. I'm going to sell it to pay off my debts. She's very unlikable. She's unrelatable. And it's through this sequence of the film, she really does try to beat down Indiana Jones. You can tell they didn't edit this part of Helena out of the film too much as they have with the start and finale. Not to get too ahead of myself, but you could really tell they were trying to build this character up to take over from Indiana Jones, and thank God they did make some changes to the film, even if it was a bit late, because if this film ended the way it was originally planned to, from what I hear allegedly, it probably would have completely sucked. And having Shaw take over in a TV or movie spin-off would have been a crime to the Indiana Jones universe. And this sets up the next action set piece in Tangier. There's a nice shot of Indy getting out of a cab and putting his hat on in silhouette just before he enters the black market establishment. This is where we're introduced to Teddy, and what I just mentioned all plays out, with him trying to recover the dial. Teddy is meant to be Helena's sidekick, and you can really tell that the plan was to pair these two up to go on their own adventures. He represents the younger, diverse crowd. Teddy was a good character. He was pretty funny. He had his own style. He's no short round, obviously. He has quirks. He's more or less a street kid who is trying to be a pilot, or wants to be a pilot. He's been surviving on the streets, and he is quite streetwise. And this also marks the first time in the film since the prologue that we see Indiana Jones dressed in the leather jacket, fedora, pants, boots, and the traditional Indiana Jones costume, which was very nice to see. It's been quite a while. First half of the film, he's still dressed like a professor with his tweed jacket and suit. It was very nice seeing Indy dressed as Indy. The only difference with the costume this time around is I think the pants are a slightly darker colour. They appear to be a little lighter in the original trilogy. That might have just been the lighting or the cinematography in the movie. But the pants seem to be a slightly darker colour. I also didn't notice a gun holster on Indy's belt or his Mark II Webley that he's carried in every film so far. Is that because he had gotten a plane and he was a fugitive and whatever, or is that some piss poor or woke attempt at an anti-gun message? Or firearms are bad, so Indiana Jones can't carry one now, despite having one in every single film and relying on it pretty heavily. Which was interesting because there's a couple of times in this movie he could have used his sidearm. And he doesn't seem to use the whip a hell of a lot either in this film. So it's about this time Shaw's character shines through. She's trying to sell the dial to some dodgy people to pay off gambling debts. She's only interested in antiquities and the past so she can sell them for her own financial gain. She owes money to a local mobster who she dates and it goes wrong. The capitalism works joke was dumb. And this is yet another Disney-produced movie where they're trying to lecture us about capitalism. Despite being one of the greediest companies on the face of the earth, all Disney give a fuck about is money. And this ideal feminist character is all about money at this stage in the film, and they're going to give the audience a lecture about capitalism. So Indy's trying to get the dial back. He does seem a little frantic. At this point in the movie, he comes off kind of like an erratic old man, as much as that pains me to say that. He seems very frantic. They try to portray him as being confused and being obsessed with this dial, and Helena is just there trying to raise the price, the bidding price. And it seems like he's this old guy that's just wandered in here. He's off his rocker and he's trying to take back the dial, even though it probably technically is more his than anybody else's. So re-enter Vola, Clabber, Calber, however you say his name, and Hawk. There's a quick reunion between Indy and Vola. They don't seem to recognise one another at first. Then they realise that, this is 20 or so years ago that he took the dial from him. Yada, yada, yada. I will say Mads' performance is pretty good. He makes such a sinister bad guy. I think most things I've seen him in, he plays a very sinister character. He doesn't have much facial expression. He relies a lot on tone of voice and eyes and how he can just create these menacing characters. Because if he didn't play Vola, I don't think the character would have been quite as sinister or as engaging. It was very reminiscent of Le Chiffre in Casino Royale. Real stone-faced psycho that he's got a plan and he'll do anything to execute said plan. He also channels Warner von Braun in this film. He dresses similar to him, and obviously that did happen. The Soviets and the Americans both gave pardons to German scientists. They gave them amnesty if they helped develop their rocket programs. Warner von Braun went to the US and worked for NASA. He was the head rocket designer and head of NASA for a long time, despite being a SS Nazi, and a pretty unemotional one. So Mads definitely channels that. And even when he's dressed casually, Vola still seems like a Nazi. He doesn't need a uniform. He can't hide his allegiance to the Third Reich, even when he's not dressed in a Nazi uniform. And this is where a bit more of the NASA backstory would have been nice. I wanted a little more fleshing out of Vola. He's an interesting character, and a bit more backstory would have gone a long way to explain his motivations a little bit more. We know what he's motivated towards. Sometimes a lot of his story comes off a little confusing because it does seem a little rushed here and there. So this leads to the next action set piece and the big rickshaw chase that we've seen on the trailers. It was pretty good. I'm not sure a rickshaw would be able to keep up with a high-powered, top-of-the-line V12 Mercedes sedan, but it's a fun sequence nonetheless. So, unfortunately, Helena's still a smartass. When she wears the red shirt, she is painfully obnoxious. Teddy, on the other hand, is a nice new addition to the cast. His character was pretty interesting. He wasn't annoying. He could believe that he could do these things. He could drive a rickshaw. He could do this. He could do that because he's been living on the streets of Tangier his entire life. The scene with the chewing gum I found amusing. The chase leads basically into the second half of the film. The government and the CIA cut ties with Voller and his crew for missing an awards ceremony with the president / we were hoping the real excuse is him murdering Indy's innocent co-workers. Mason tries to stop them, and unfortunately she gets murked along with her crew. The character of Mason isn't really developed much in this movie. She's not in it a hell of a lot. Despite being featured on the poster, she's not really much of a main character in this. Because I was kind of liking her character. She was mysterious. She had a conscience. And unfortunately she exits stage left because it's more convenient to get rid of her than to keep her in the script. So this brings up a big question about Clabber. He's American and he's just killed American servicemen on a government helicopter. So why is he doing this? Why does he just go along with the doctor's orders? And once again, this comes back into backstory. There's not enough known about him or Hawk. They just come off like generic henchmen, which is unfortunate because Boyd Holbrook is a pretty decent actor. He can do a lot with the henchman kind of a character. He was great in Logan. And I wanted a bit more out of Clabber and his backstory to kind of find out why he has just sided with the enemy. Is it for money? We kind of assume it's for money, but he does seem pretty loyal to Voller. So who's flying the helicopter? We assume one of them. Either way, these are just pointless little details that I kind of get obsessed over. So this brings us to the Mediterranean Sea, and we're introduced to Antonio Banderas. Antonio Banderas' character is a friend of Indy, a longtime friend. This brings us to a pretty emotionally charged scene on Banderas' boat. Helena and Indy are talking. Shaw asks Indy if you could go back in time, when and where would you go back? And she rambles about making money and about going back and collecting artifacts so she could sell them and become rich. And Indy, in one of the most emotional performances I've ever seen Harrison Ford deliver, Indy replies he would go back in time and stop his son joining the army and going to the war and getting killed. And we assume that this is the Vietnam War because obviously he was around in the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which was set in the late 50s. Indy isn't able to console Marion after Mutt's death, which leads to the breakdown of their marriage and for Marion to file divorce papers. Indy buries himself in work as a way of dealing with it. There is some brilliant acting by Harrison Ford in this scene. It's some of his best work. It's a bit of a diversion from the traditional Indy we know from the previous films. I don't think he's ever got this emotional. And I'm not really surprised it's James Mangold, and this is kind of what he does. He did it with Logan. But seeing an emotional Indiana Jones, it was a nice surprise. And Harrison Ford is brilliant in this scene. It adds another layer and complexity to the character. And it shuts up Helena rambling about money. She's been rambling on about her selfish needs and about making money. And Indy chooses a very personal, very emotional part in history. He still proves that he is still the same Indy. Yes, he might be weathered by the years. And like the old saying, it's not the years, it's the mileage. He doesn't choose the financial gain over something that had a huge impact on him and Marion's relationship. And this also answers the question as to why Mutt wasn't in this film. There's probably a hell of a lot more reasons to do with Shia LaBeouf not being in it than just that, but yeah, you get my drift. Shaw's attitude changes a bit after this. We're also filled in with the backstory of Teddy, which is basically just a carbon copy of Short Round. And you can tell that the plan was to have Helena star in a TV show or a movie and be a whole Indiana Jones spin-off, and Teddy is meant to be the sidekick. It's another cue that she was meant to take the whip and fedora. Indy tells her not to sell the dial as it could be very dangerous if it falls into the wrong hands, and sticking true to the character of Indiana Jones, he doesn't want the bad guys getting a hold of something that could potentially have great consequences on the world. So this leads to the diving scene Ronaldo, which is played by Antonio Banderas, Indy and Shaw dive down to the wreck of a Roman ship to find the next piece of the dial. Unfortunately for Indy, the ship is full of eels. So in this film, they've replaced the snakes with eels, which is, a nice change, I guess. You can't always have the same gag. It was also weird seeing Indy in the water and diving. Once again, it was nice to see Indy out of his comfort zone. It suits the character and his adventurous nature, so why not? So Voller catches up with Indy and co. He's now in possession of the dial. Indy refuses to read it. So Shaw says she'd read it. She's still the same money-grubbing capitalist as she was half an hour ago. And this is the real problem in this film, is that a lot of the action scenes are not really initiated by Indy. They come off more as him getting dragged into them by Helena, or he's trying to catch up with her, or he's chasing his tail and it's kind of her leading the way. It's Shaw's adventure and Indy is just tagging along for the ride. So it's unlike the previous films where Indy has always initiated the action, or he's been the main driving factor in the action scenes. Helena takes too much center stage in this, which is very annoying. It's not as annoying as some people have reported in their reviews, but it is still very noticeable. And after all, this is supposed to be a fucking Indiana Jones film. It's supposed to be the fifth and final Indy film and his last hurrah, and in some parts he is nearly relegated to the role of a sidekick. In some parts of the film there are two sidekicks in this. He's either taken the back seat and Helena and Teddy step up, or he doesn't figure out something first. It's Helena, despite him being the archaeologist with 50 plus years experience. They escape from Voller, get on his boat and make a head start for the third and final piece of the dial. Unfortunately, the getaway seems to be more or less in a straight line, and Voller kind of watches them through binoculars most of the way, so he's got a pretty good idea of where they're going to end up. This brings us to Sicily. There's a kind of a funny scene with Teddy pickpocketing a rich, entitled white kid's pocket because he made fun of him for having dirty shoes or dirty clothes or something like that, or not having proper shoes or something like that. So he steals the rich kid's money, then goes buys an ice cream, which unfortunately leads to him getting kidnapped by Voller because Voller is waiting for him. Because as I just mentioned, he pretty much knows where they're going. Indy stocks up on gear. He gets a backpack and some rope. Helena buys herself a new outfit. She looks more like a traditional explorer with a white shirt, khaki pants and brown boots. When she changes the costume, she also changes her attitude. She's not as intensely annoying as she has been. And this is also where Indy takes command of his own film. She starts to follow him a bit more. It's not all her just following Indy around and taking his lead, but it's far more balanced than what we have seen in the previous half of the film. So she's got this new white outfit. She looks more like an adventurer, and she suits the part a little more than she did with the red satin shirt and the black pants. This signals a change in the character, and I'm going to take a wild guess and say this also signifies a lot of the material that was reshot for the ending of this film. So Voller kidnaps Teddy, Indy pursues. The pair steal a car and race to the cave of Dionysus to get there before Voller to find the final piece of the dial. If I haven't mentioned it already, the Dial of Destiny is also known as the Archimedes Dial. The dial is based on the real-life artifact, the Antikythera mechanism, or the Antikythera computer, which is believed to have been made by Archimedes. The big theory on the Antikythera mechanism is that it was some type of celestial tracking device and a way to track weather, lunar and solar cycles, and stuff like that. But like a lot of things in history, no one really knows for sure. So the pair find the cave of Dionysus before Voller and crew. They have a pretty good head start. So Indy and Helena climb up a rock face. Indy explains the injuries, how many times he's been shot. He's got a fake hip and a couple of screws. And Helena is half his age. Which is a nice scene. I liked Indy not taking shit and saying, he is twice her age. He has all these injuries from many adventures. I liked how that played out. And it's consistent because Indy throughout this film hasn't been trying to act young. Sometimes when movies like this are made, after so many years, and they try to revive an old action hero, a lot of the time they try to act like they did in the first couple of films, and it doesn't really work. And I like that this Indiana Jones is good with where he is. He's accepted that he is an older adventurer, and he doesn't try to act like a young man, and Harrison doesn't try to play him like a young man. He's very much accepted that he is a bit older and he can't do things like he used to. So I did like that aspect of it, even though he does, move pretty well for an older explorer. He doesn't try to act young, and he doesn't try to repeat what he did in the previous films. He's not jumping off things like he used to, which is fair enough. He also acknowledges the road he's been on and his past mistakes, which is a hell of a lot more than we get out of Helena. She is very one-dimensional, and if this is what Disney and Kathleen Kennedy think is an idealistic and virtuous female character, I think they need to reassess what they think is important in a character. They find the Tomb of Archimedes, which leads to the third and final piece of the dial. They find it before Vola. Indy and Helena have to go through a series of puzzles to try to gain access to the tomb. The first one being to sneak through a narrow passage in the rock, crawling with bugs and spiders. That's about as far as I would have gone, which is very reminiscent of previous Indy films like the Temple of Doom, with the chamber full of bugs where Willie's got to put a hand in it, and obviously the opening of Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indy seems to panic when he has a tarantula hanging off of his hat, which I did find a little amusing because he doesn't seem to have a problem having his entire back covered with them. Helena doesn't seem to panic as much. Indy seems to be a bit more panicky. So is this another dig by Disney saying, oh, look how strong and courageous this female character is? Oh, the old adventurer is freaking out by a couple of bugs. Because I don't think at this point in his career, Indy is going to give two fucks about some bugs. I don't think he's going to freak out about them. He hasn't in the other films. The only thing that really seems to get him is snakes. Bugs, he's cool with. Snakes is a different story. So it was kind of a little out of character and a little bit annoying to see Indy freak out about some bugs. So this leads to a pool and a room full of methane. There's a couple of dead Roman soldiers, which is a pretty clear indication that if you stay in here too long, you're probably going to end up like them. They figure it out, which leads to them finding the way into Archimedes' tomb. This leads to the discovery of Archimedes and the third and final piece of the dial. Helena discovers some interesting depictions on the frieze on Archimedes' tomb. You see what was described as a phoenix with propellers. They open the tomb and discover the third and final piece. Indy also discovers that Archimedes is wearing a modern-day watch. Enter the time travel plot. Vola and Co are in hot pursuit with Teddy. They're hoping that he can lead them to the entrance. There's a reason they need him. I can't quite remember now what that is. Teddy gets the jump on Vola and crew. He gets away. So Vola catches up with Indy and Shaw. Indy is shot. He seems to be shot in the shoulder. The gunshot appears to be pretty serious, and it looks like Indy is in a bit of trouble. He hasn't been shot or this badly injured in any of the movies, despite all the highly dangerous situations he's found himself in the past. So the final act, Indy is shot, Vola completes the dial and takes Indy hostage. There's an attempt at a rescue by Teddy and Helena. They get out, leaving Indy behind. I'm sure if KK had it her way, Indy would get killed there and Helena would take over and save the day. It's not clear why he does take him hostage. I think he's pretty confident that he knows how the dial works. Maybe I just forgot that. Vola takes Indy to a plane that he has stashed on a nearby runway, and this is where Vola reveals his true colours. Vola and his men put on their vintage SS uniforms and start goose-stepping around in the rain at the airfield before boarding their vintage German transport plane, and we finally get the reveal to Vola's big plan. So him and his men are all dressed in SS uniforms, and it becomes very clear that Vola and his crew are all still loyal Nazis or Nazi sympathisers who are still loyal to the Third Reich. Vola wants to use the dial to go back in time to 1939, and now the dial is complete, it can finally work properly. The dial picks up natural fissures in time, which is kind of cool if that exists. So the plane takes off and heads to this fissure / portal that's opening up in the sky. Helena is in hot pursuit. She dumps Teddy at the airfield, steals a bike and chases after the plane, and hops on before it takes off. Teddy hides out in a plane before he decides he wants to be a pilot and chases after them. A little improbable, but the backstory has been filled in because he does have an interest in flying. And at this point in the film, it's getting to that point where you're just like, yeah, just go with it. It is a fun movie, so let's just see how this plays out. So Helena's chasing after the plane. She lands on the landing gear, hides out in the cargo bay or the crawl spaces in between the plane. Voller sets the dial in motion. Now his grand plan is to go back to 1939 and kill Hitler, in the hopes that a stronger leader will replace him and lead Germany to a glorious victory over the Allies in World War II. And this goes back to the comments he made to the waiter in the beginning of the film. He's still very bitter how things turned out, and even though that he has this new life in the United States, where he's designing rockets and making friends in high places, Voller is still a hardcore Nazi at heart, and nothing is going to change that. So what could go wrong? They want to go back in time and kill Hitler. The consequences of time travel aren't fully explained in this, like they are in Back to the Future and movies like that. So what could go wrong? They want to go back in time and kill Hitler. It's a very loose plan. Why not lead Germany to victory himself? And this is one of the interesting things about Voller's character, is he doesn't like to take direct responsibility. He doesn't want to be the guy leading. He kind of wants to facilitate a strong leader into a victory. So he's not a man that's motivated by glory or power. He more or less wants to work for the common good of the Nazi cause, which I found interesting. He's not a selfishly motivated character like Helena is. So what is going to happen? He's got Indy in the plane, and by this time you're kind of thinking that Indiana Jones would have bled out from the gunshot, but somehow he's still alive, and that's good because it is an Indiana Jones film. So he starts putting the calculations to the time in, and Indy explains to him that he hasn't accounted for the continental drift, and if his calculations are incorrect, he probably isn't going to end up in 1939 like he has planned. Ultimately, Indy is proven right. He has the wrong date. Portal opens. Teddy's in pursuit. Voller's going over in his head. Do we call it off or do we keep going? He aborts the mission, but it's too late, and they get sucked into a time fissure. The plane gets sucked into the portal, and they get spit out the other side, where they find themselves in not 1939, and this is a very big spoiler alert. They find themselves in 212 BC during the Battle of Syracuse. The plane comes through the portal, it flies over the battle, there's Roman ships attacking the Greek city of Syracuse. And this is a pretty wild ending, and I had a big smile on my face when I was watching this because it was so over the top and it did fit Indiana Jones perfectly. So this movie, for all of its faults, manages to retain the Indiana Jones feeling. The action isn't outlandish or as well directed or even as comical as Spielberg's action in the previous films. Mangold does try, but the film always retains the Indiana Jones feel. So both the Romans and Greeks think the planes are dragons flying over the battlefield. Each side think it's the other side's dragons, and the Romans begin to fire ballista bolts at the plane. The plane is damaged by the ballista fire. Indy gets free. Helena comes out of the panels to help save the day. Voller and Indy have a bit of a fight. Clubber is shooting Romans with a MG42 from the plane, which you think would fuck up the timeline a bit, because if archaeologists find Roman bodies in the future that have bullet damage or bullet damage to the surrounding buildings or whatever, you think that they would fuck with the timeline a bit. The pilots are killed in the process. Of course they are, because the pilots are always the first ones to get it. Voller at this point realizes he is absolutely fucked. Indy and Helena parachute out of the plane. The plane crashes and all the Nazis are killed. This is where we're introduced to Aristotle. Aristotle takes Voller's watch off of his corpse, which is obviously the same watch that you see him with in the tomb. Aristotle and a couple of his bodyguards make their way up the beach, where he confronts Indy. And this is a really cool scene. Indy is meeting a real-life historical figure, and not just reading about him in a book a few thousand years after they've died. Indy's gravely wounded, and realizing he is probably near the end. Teddy lands the plane. Indy decides that he wants to stay and be a part of history and not just observe it. He has spent his entire life studying it, and he wants to have this final opportunity to stay in the past, observe it, and then die in the past. After 40 years, we get a new range of emotions and elements to the Indiana Jones character. And this is testament to Harrison Ford's performance. It is fucking excellent. And we haven't seen Indiana Jones get this emotional before. So it was a real thrill to see that even after 5 films, Indiana Jones has still got a couple of surprises left in store for us. Indy wants to stay and witness the past and be a part of history. Helena explains to him why this is not a good idea, and this fits into the whole paradox of time travel. Change one thing, change everything. And if he stays, he could fuck up history more and more. So Helena knocks out Indiana Jones, and then he wakes up in his apartment back in Manhattan in 1969. I didn't really like the knocking out of Indiana Jones, especially by Helena. The big reason being that the hero probably shouldn't get knocked out. And realistically, she probably couldn't. Then how is she supposed to drag him back to the plane and put him on it? And just like that, we've had this completely over-the-top wild ending involving time travel and going back into history. And just like that, we're back in Manhattan in 1969. So Indy wakes up, Helena is there to greet him. Sola and the grandkids come into the apartment, followed by a very well overdue cameo, and that is none other than Marion Ravenwood. It was a very nice, emotional, sweet ending. I nearly started tearing up when I saw these two reunited again. It is a bit of a tear-jerking reunion. It was also a bit sad. I did feel quite emotional and sad at the end of this movie, unlike previous Indiana Jones films that always leave it on a high note, which is, Spielberg and George Lucas trait. There was always that sense that there could be another adventure. This time it seems a bit more permanent. It definitely feels like this is the last time we're ever going to see Indiana Jones on the big screen, or Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones. And there is no one else that can play Indiana Jones. Harrison Ford is Indiana Jones, end of fucking debate. Indy and Marion have a touching reunion. She decides not to go through with the divorce, and we assume everything is good. Helena takes Sulla and the kids out for ice cream. Indy and Marion kiss and make up, recalling the scene from the ship's cabin in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is a bit of a nice nostalgic touch. And it did fit the ending really well. There's nothing like ending on a bit of nostalgia, and this really did fit quite nicely. It's also a little weird not seeing Indiana Jones in the leather jacket and fedora, or a tweed suit. He's wearing track pants and a pajama top or a hoodie, I think, which is definitely a new look for Dr. Jones. Helena is dressed in a brown denim or suede trucker-style jacket. She also has her own wide-brim hat, which is very reminiscent of the Indiana Jones costume. You don't have to be a film expert to work that one out. And it definitely seems like she is being groomed to take over the role. It's definitely suggesting that she may be taking over, whether in film or in TV. Indy's fedora is drying on the line. Just as the movie's about to finish, he puts his hand through, grabs the hat, and yanks it back in the window, leaving us with a little hint or some hope that this might not be Indiana Jones's final adventure. We can only hope. So, looking at the ending again, it's a very wild ending, but it's also very anticlimactic. Just when we're getting used to the madness of the time travel finale, Indy being in 212 BC, just like that we're pulled out of it and we're taken back to 1960s Manhattan. And this goes back to all the controversy surrounding the ending of the film. If rumours are true, there were 6 endings to this film. 4 of them were not very well liked at all. One apparently involved Indy dying or going back in time, meeting his younger self, and then both the young and old Indy are killed and blinked out of existence in their own world. That was apparently Kathleen's preferred ending. The male legacy hero was killed off in his own franchise, leaving Helena to pick up the fedora and whip and carry on the adventures in either a spin-off movie or a TV show, or maybe she does become Indiana Jones when she goes back through time. So despite the fact that the story for this film was so heavily guarded for such a long time, it always seems that time travel was a part of it. And it seems like time travel is once again used as a plot tool to facilitate change in another franchise that is being mismanaged. I mean, really, come up with some original stories, because it is really wearing thin, using time travel to correct everything or go back and change the past so you can have a strong female character take over from the male character. Why can't the strong male character just have his day, have his franchise, then do the adventures of Helena Shaw and Teddy in a TV show? Make it separate from Indiana Jones, but still part of the same universe. And then when Disney Plus gets, a couple hundred people watching it per week, then they'll finally realize that it's a failure and no one likes it. Why destroy the legacy of Indiana Jones in the process just to prove a fucking point? Why can't Indy be kept as the Indy we all know and love? Because so far we've had two of Harrison Ford's legacy characters wrecked by the same company and the same producer, Kathleen Kennedy. Han Solo got a very disrespectful end. He was just killed like a fucking stormtrooper or the Emperor, then dropped into a bottomless pit. And in Indiana Jones, even though he doesn't die, I think the original plan was to kill him off and have Helena take over. It seems like the producers decided with their better judgment to go with Indy getting injured, going back in time, but then coming back and living happily ever after with Marion, as it always should be. And that is the biggest problem with the film, besides Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Helena, is at the start of the film seems very structured and very organised. The midway point, it starts to get a little wobbly. It's still structured, it still has that order to it. But the second half of this film is very messy, specifically the ending. You can really tell it's very choppy and it's very messy, and a lot of things had been changed very quickly. I definitely think there was more than one ending in consideration, and we know there was reshoots that took place in January of this year, and it definitely seems to be why this movie was so up and down, especially towards the end. It's very messy, then it's very anticlimactic, almost like the director and producers just said, near enough is good enough, let's just finish it and get this movie out. Bob Iger and Disney didn't want to delay it any longer, and you can't blame them for that because it was 2.5 years overdue, and it's the most expensive film Lucasfilm has produced. And as the box office is tracking so far, it doesn't look like it's going to make its money back, and it definitely doesn't look like it's going to make nearly enough to try to cover the production and marketing costs and make some profit. The film is well paced overall. It does move along very quickly. The movie is 2 hours and 34 minutes, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like a shorter film, mainly because the start of it is so well structured and well paced. The opening is good. There's no dead space. It's all action as soon as it starts. One action scene leads to the next plot setup, which leads to the next action sequence, and so on and so on. It's a big series of action, plot reveal, push the story forward, next action scene, repeat. Having said that, it does feel like there is something missing from this film, and it's very hard to touch on apart from editing out any scene that had Helena in it, which would be the ideal situation. But it does seem that there is something missing. There is some element that isn't quite right or isn't in there enough compared to the other Indiana Jones films. I think this would be a lot different if Spielberg and Lucas had more to do with the production, especially if Spielberg directed it. It does retain the Indiana Jones feel, but there is that one element that is quite off. And I think this does go back to the reshoots and just having not the strongest story to begin with. It is a bit piss poor in places. The time travel plot isn't as bad as I think a lot of people are probably expecting. It does fit the Indiana Jones world nicely. And the time travel plot definitely opens up a lot of new plot avenues you can use to explore in either, spin-off TV shows or movies. But before we get to any of that, we need to have a good, solid Indiana Jones film. And while it was very enjoyable, I did like it. It is a very solid action film. There is something missing. If we had better producing and writing behind it, not so much. I think the writing was as good as it can be while working for Disney and Kathleen Kennedy standing over your shoulder, breathing down your neck. If you took Kathleen Kennedy out of the equation and her trying to steer the ship towards this woke, politically correct, fucking feminist propaganda angle in the story, I think the movie would have been a hell of a lot better. Recast Phoebe Waller-Bridge with someone likable, have her not be another carbon copy of Rey and another, Mary Sue type obnoxious know-it-all character. And I think if they did that missing element in the film would now be complete. You can also tell that the editing team had a pretty tough time on this film. They had to try to recycle and recut a lot of things out of this. They did their best, and it's not very noticeable in the first half. It's more the second half, more so towards the end of the film, that the re-editing does creep in quite a bit. Because like I said, when Helena is in Tangier, she's very unlikable, but she's a completely different character by the end of the film. And she doesn't have much of an evolution or much of a character arc, so this, you can kind of tell that this wasn't necessarily planned in the original script, and a lot of stuff was either changed or modified. I also get the feeling that they cut a lot of the snarky comments and jokes out that I've been hearing so much about. And I wouldn't be surprised if the rumours were true and they did cut a lot of the snarky comments that Helena makes to Indy out. And they try to make the second half of the film geared more towards Indiana Jones leading the show rather than him being a sidekick in his own franchise and his own film. So as I said, the second half of the film is very messy and quite choppy compared to the structure of the first act. It also leaves a lot of questions that are not answered, like how do they leave the past, and a lot of minor details that probably aren't the most important, but if it went on any longer, the movie would be pushing the 3-hour mark. A lot of the consequences about altering timelines and going back into the past aren't really touched upon after this. So it seems like time travel was a very convenient plot tool, but the consequences of said plot tool aren't really explained that well. And this is the same for Indy's injury. He seems to get shot in the shoulder. He's on the back of the plane for a long time. He would have bled out a long time before he got into the time fissure. But you know what? Yeah, it's an action movie, so yeah, who gives a shit at the end of the day? It was a fun movie, so this is just minor nitpicking. I can't help thinking that if they did stick to the original ending and they did kill Indy off, just how bad that would have been. There's some characters I don't think you can kill off, and Indiana Jones is one of them. I didn't think Han would... I knew he was going to get killed in The Force Awakens, but I didn't think it'd be as disrespectful as how it turned out. So all in all, Harrison Ford does drive this film. His performance is excellent. He really cares about the character of Indiana Jones, and he puts everything into this film. We get new elements to Indy's character. We get the old familiar elements. He definitely pulls it off in a very unique and original way. The film was a lot more emotional than I was expecting. All the reunions in it were really nice with Sulla and Marion. And overall, James Mangold's directing was pretty damn good. I think he did a pretty good job with what he had. I mean, it's not Spielberg-esque action, or it's not really like the original ones that much. It does feel like an indie film. Having said that, the directing was still pretty good. Similar in style to Wolverine, the second one, not so much Logan, where it has a lot of very intense action scenes, but the ending of Wolverine was a bit anticlimactic, and it had a couple of head-scratching moments with the claws being broken and him growing the bone claws again, which factored into Days of Future Past. It was very similar to that. The big fight with the mechanical robot samurai was pretty piss weak overall. And this is a very similar tone to The Dial of Destiny. It's a lot of hype, a lot of cool elements, but it was a bit anticlimactic. And the hero is the hero, but he is more like Wolverine was in Logan, a bit more defeated, a bit more broken down, a bit more emotional compared to Wolverine we have seen in the past, if that makes any sense at all. Mangold's definitely got the directing chops to pull off a big action-adventure film like this. He's good with drama and emotion, pretty good with action, okay with comedy. I just can't help but wonder what the film might have been like without all the studio oversight, and without Disney and Kathleen Kennedy looking over his shoulder and micromanaging everything. I would like to see what the unmolested version of this film would have looked like. So all in all, I give this movie about a 3.5 to 4 out of 5 stars. That's pretty good. It was entertaining. It's got Harrison Ford. It's Indiana Jones. What more could you want? It's not as bad as everyone says it is. It's a big action-adventure film. It is pretty enjoyable. Just turn your brain off and just go with it. I did enjoy it. I have thought about seeing it again, but with the price of everything today, I don't think that will be happening. It's not as good as the originals. Nothing is, nothing ever will be. I think these films would probably be a lot better in a lot of people's eyes if they didn't hold them in the same standard as the originals. Just be thankful we have another Indiana Jones film. We've waited 15 years for it. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't quite the swan song Harrison Ford or Indiana Jones deserved. It would have been a hell of a lot better without Disney, and it would have been much better if Steven Spielberg directed it and George Lucas wrote it. I like Kingdom of the Crystal Skulls. I don't think that film is half as bad as what everyone says it is. The Dial of Destiny and the overarching story does fit nicely into the world of Indiana Jones. But like everything, this film isn't without its flaws. I also can't help but think, what would Steven Spielberg have done? How would he have rounded out the Indiana Jones saga? What plot lines would he come up with? How would the action look? How would the character traits of Indiana Jones change after all these years? Would it have been as emotional as Mangold's? I guess we never know. I can't wait for the Blu-ray. I wouldn't mind a director's cut of this film, even though it is pretty long as it is. So that is the review complete. However, Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is in for some pretty rough waters. It has had a staggeringly low box office opening. It's the lowest opening weekend an Indiana Jones film has had. It doesn't look like it's going to be picking up too much more. I think it's only grossed in the US 150 million and 170 million worldwide, or 100 million in the US and 80 something million worldwide, which is not a very good start. So will KK find herself on the chopping block? It's about time. Lucasfilm needs to fuck her off for good. They should have done it after The Last Jedi. Disney needs to get rid of her, and I'm pretty sure Bob Iger wants her gone as quickly as possible. She has caused enough damage to the legacies of Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and especially to Harrison Ford's characters, Han Solo and Indiana Jones. She is 100% fucking toxic. Under her watch, the film came in a year and a half overdue and heavily over budget. I've heard a few reports from different people, from podcasts and YouTube, that there wasn't many people in the theatres. The cinemas weren't even half packed, but as I've said on a couple of shows, I think this is the new normal when it comes to cinema. Streaming and video games are a big contender now for box office takings, and I just don't think that movies are going to get the massive box office draws like they used to. I don't think this movie went according to Bob Iger and Disney's plan. I think they were hoping for a lot more, but a lot of Disney movies have had pretty similar box office takings. This could be because the quality of the content isn't very good, and in most cases it's not. The Little Mermaid was an overinflated remake of a classic that had no soul. Indiana Jones is a bit more complex. They keep remaking these films in the hope of a quick cash grab, and they end up just destroying the legacy of these films. Little Mermaid had a pretty poor box office taking, and so did the last couple of Disney theatrical released remakes, and they still haven't got the message. So the other problem with The Dial of Destiny is there are decent sections of this film where it's the Phoebe Waller-Bridge Helena Shaw show. She seems to lead Indy around rather than Indy going on an adventure with her as a sidekick. As I said before, it's very uneven, and there was obvious reshoots and re-editing of this film, specifically the final act of the film and the ending. James Mangold has gone on record on Twitter to say that this is not the case and no reshoots took place, which we know now is a complete lie because John Williams and Harrison Ford have confirmed it in interviews given at the start of the year. There is a bit of a feminist message in this movie. I mean, I'm all for diversity in films as long as it's done right and it's just not shoved in your face, and it's not this LGBTQ woke fucking agenda being shoved down your throat. 80s movies managed to be diverse. I mean, Hollywood seems to think they were all one-sided, which is just not the case. Terminator and Aliens, two of my favourite films, both have a strong female lead, but the difference is with Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor and Sigourney Weaver as Ellen Ripley, they are real, relatable and believable characters, where Helena and Ray are not. They're trying too hard to not just be the male character, but to overtake the male character. They're so perfect, it can do everything, they don't need any help, and they have no vulnerability, which is not realistic. And all you have to do is Google Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny box office to find out that this film is in big fucking trouble. And it's not just the Dial of Destiny. There are many articles titled Summer Flopbusters, Why Indiana Jones and the Flash Box Office Bombs. So the flopbuster seems to be the new catchphrase of the year. So it's not just Indiana Jones. A lot of these huge movies are flopping. I think Transformers is doing pretty average. I think The Flash is getting pulled from cinemas by Warner Brothers because it's lost so much money, and The Little Mermaid hasn't really made much of a splash, pun intended. Which is a shame for Harrison Ford. He deserves to go out as Indiana Jones on a much better note. He's been entertaining us for 40 years with Indiana Jones, and this is just a very poor note to end on, and the responsibility of this falls down to Kathleen Kennedy, Bob Iger, and Disney. But before I go into some of the box office numbers, I came across an article on Fandom Wire titled, "I was disappointed Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones co-star wasn't happy with James Mangold's script after Steven Spielberg left as movie struggles at the box office." Yeah, I'm not surprised. I think there's a lot of people who are a bit pissed off with his script. The last Indiana Jones project for Harrison Ford is finally in theaters. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny sees the titular character and his goddaughter, played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, race against time to change the course of history. The film is directed and written by Logan director James Mangold. Before James Mangold, though, Steven Spielberg was sitting in the director's chair. However, he stepped down in February 2020, and that is an absolute crime to movies. I've got a feeling this movie would have been much better if he had directed it. And the responsibilities went to James Mangold. The filmmaker decided to create a fresh script for the film, as most of these directors do. They have to one-up the director before them. They can't just try to execute that director's vision. They got to rip up the script and start fresh. Which, just might be a thing. Maybe the styles were different. Who knows? While there aren't many details about the original script, and that's very convenient, what we do know is that it would have made an actress very happy. The new script simply disappointed because she wanted more of a relationship between her character and Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones. Actress Kerry Allen played the role of the tough-talking love interest of Indiana Jones, Marion Ravenwood. Fans were introduced to the character in Raiders of the Lost Ark, but she was missing MIA for Temple of Doom and The Last Crusade. And obviously, Temple of Doom was the prequel to Raiders. Allen finally reprised her role in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, where Marion tied the knot with Harrison Ford's Indy after he found out they had a child. Of course, Dial of Destiny had to shine a light on the fact that the lead character was a husband and father. However, it was not what many, including Allen, might have hoped. The actress stated that she presumed the story would focus on Marion and Indy's relationship. What happened instead was that the fictional couple ended up separating after their son, Mutt Williams, was killed in Vietnam. According to Allen, the script from when Steven Spielberg was directing was more focused on the couple. Things changed when Mangold stepped in. Talking to Variety, Allen stated, and this is a quote from her, "I think because the last time you see Indy and Marion, they've gotten married. I don't know that I thought we'd pick it up from where we left off, but I did always imagine that it would be a story with Indy and Marion going forward. When Steven was going to direct the film, I think the scripts were more focused on Indy and Marion's story." Very, very interesting. And that would have been a awesome film to see. I would have liked to see the Spielberg version of Dial of Destiny, and that is one of the big criticisms with this film, is Kerry Allen just isn't in it enough. She is more or less just a cameo and nothing more. And there's that shot in the trailer where you see his hat and stuff on the table, and there's the updated trailer where it's the same scene and there's a small photo of Marion next to the hat, which I can't remember if that was in the film or not. But when Steven stepped aside and James came in, he started fresh with new writers, and they just went in the direction they went in. They were going to tell a different story. That's not to say that I had ever read a script that Steven was working on, because I hadn't. But I just knew from conversations that we'd had that the ongoing story had involved Marion in a much bigger way than the story they ended up with. Interesting. Not just Allen, the change in the script disappointed a lot of fans who absolutely shipped Marion and Indiana Jones. Who would have thought? When asked by Variety how she felt about the separation and Mutt's death, she stated that she was simply disappointed. She had known that the team did not want to continue with LaBeouf and that they would have to come up with a story for his absence. However, she only got to know that Mutt would be killed off in Vietnam just 6 months before the shooting. This is another quote from her. "Well, I was disappointed, of course. I knew that there had been talk that they did not want to go forward with Shire, so I knew that something in the story had to create the potential for him not to be there in a way that made sense. I didn't know that he was going to die in Vietnam until I read the script. Oh gosh, it was maybe 6 months before they were going to start shooting." On the brighter side, Allen was happy that at least her character's story ended up with a happy ending, something she envisioned for her and Indy. She feels profoundly happy that the two ended up reconciling at the very end of the film. And yeah, look, it was a good end for those two, and yeah, it was a bit tear-jerking. They finally come back together. it would have been nice if there was a little bit more Marion in the movie. But it was a nice way to end and round out the series with these two reconciling. I was deeply happy that Marion came back, at least the end of the story. If this is indeed truly the last film of this particular group of films, if this is the last story with Harrison as Indy and me as Marion, I was profoundly happy that I didn't end without them coming back together. That meant a lot to me, to feel like they were going to ride off into the sunset together. Well said. It sure would have been absolutely wholesome seeing Indy as a family man with Marion and Mutt. Unfortunately, Mangold had a different route in mind, as he usually does. At the box office, Dial of Destiny seems to be struggling a bit, despite the 4th of July holiday. While the opening was estimated to be somewhere between 80 to 85 million, it could only make 71 million by Monday. Ooh. July the 3rd, according to the Box Office Mojo, the film sits at 83 million at the moment. So that's been out for a week and it's about halfway to the projected opening weekend estimate. I think Disney and Iger are getting ahead of themselves. I know this movie has to make like 900 million to make a profit. Kathleen Kennedy and Iger are pretty adamant that this movie is going to get to the $1 billion mark. I don't share their enthusiasm. I don't think many films this year are probably going to get to that mark. I think Mission Impossible 7 will, because it's Tom Cruise. He gives a fuck about his audience. That's the difference. When he makes a film, it's for the audience and not for the shareholders. So let's talk about the Dial of Destiny's box office. It's according to Box Office Mojo. As it stands on the 7th of July, 2023, the domestic take, which accounts for 56% of the global box office takings, is $89,397,064. International accounts for 44%, sitting on $70,179,000, giving a worldwide total of $159 million. That's a long way off of $1 billion. And that's taken into consideration the production costs and marketing costs of The Dial of Destiny. According to Wikipedia, the film cost between 250 to 300 million, which makes it the most expensive of the Indy films and the most expensive film that Lucasfilm has produced. Coming in second place is Solo, and that movie didn't make a dent in the box office. It made about 350 million, and it cost around 320 something million because they ended up having to reshoot most of it. That's a lot of money for a movie, considering you have to make nearly the 8 to 900 million just to break even. Right, I got another article on BBC.com entitled, "Does Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny mark the era of the flopbuster?" It's by Nicholas Barber, 6th of July, 2023. The latest Indiana Jones, The Flash, and Elemental have been disappointing at the box office. Does that mean that Hollywood is in crisis? Asks Nicholas Barber. Indiana Jones might be able to unearth the Ark of the Covenant, but can he fill cinemas? Apparently not. 15 years on from Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, Ford's whip-cracking archaeologist is back in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But so far, audience haven't come back with him. The film made 130 million at the global box office on its opening weekend, which may sound impressive, but which is actually underwhelming. Rebecca Rubin wrote in Variety, "This is," she pointed out, "one of the most expensive movies ever, costing $295 million before marketing. Probably pretty safely say that this movie cost $350 million to make, which is a fucking lot of money even by today's standards. So it is unlikely to make a profit in cinemas." Anthony D'Alessandro at Deadline went further. "It was," he said, "a disastrous result. The sad fact is that Dial of Destiny didn't deserve to do any better. The film is dour, dreary, and largely pointless rehash of Indy's other escapades. But he wasn't the only hero to fall short last weekend. According to Rubin, DC's beleaguered superhero blockbuster The Flash had an embarrassing showing. DreamWorks and Universal's Ruby Gilman, Teenage Kraken, Created, and another animation, Elemental, hasn't lived up to Pixar standards. In his review of Elemental in The Guardian, Peter Bradshaw pondered, "The question of whether Pixar's golden age is irrevocably behind us. The film was Pixar's worst US box office opening weekend since their first film, the original Toy Story." Wow. Overall said, Ruben, the summer has so far had a series of underwhelming tentpoles. And before the summer, things were hardly overwhelming either. Both DC's Black Adam and Marvel's Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania fared badly, leading to claims that audiences might have superhero fatigue. And you couldn't blame them when a majority of the films that come out are superheroes these days. Bucking the trend, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse has done even better than the first film in the series, Spider-Man Into the Spideyverse. But there are too many flopbusters coming out these days to ignore. Ever since Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker and Avengers Endgame came out in 2019, Hollywood seems to be in some sort of endgame itself. Mark Harris is the author of Pictures at a Revolution, a book about Bonnie and Clyde, and the other radical new Hollywood dramas that took over in the mid-1960s when the traditional studio system was faltering. What's happening in the film industry now, he said on Twitter this week, is frighteningly reminiscent of what happened just before the new Hollywood revival. I don't think any moment since 20 years ago has resembled the pre-revolution crisis as much as this one does. Bigger, longer, more bloated movies, most of which are lesser versions of what worked 20 years ago. A panic about the waning clout of movie stars, a fearful understanding of old marketing approaches, are simply failing to reach or excite vast swaths of the movie-going audience. I dread that Hollywood's best creative days are behind it. Dark times. He may have a point. A lot of movies, the running time is very bloated. A lot of them don't really need to be over 2.5 hours. They would be much better if they were edited down more. Why was Babylon 3 hours and something minutes? I don't even think Avatar: The Way of Water needed to be 3 hours and 10 minutes. While the pacing of Indy was good, maybe 10 minutes difference to trim the fat probably would have made a hell of a lot of difference. And this ties into the question, was a fifth Indiana Jones film even necessary? Is the Star Wars sequel trilogy necessary? 58,000 Marvel movies necessary and accompanying TV shows? These studios are spending a hell of a lot of money on movies that not a lot of people are seeing. Yes, they may do better on streaming, but you also have to factor in that Blu-ray sales are down and you pay, 20-something bucks for a brand new Blu-ray as opposed to $7 a month, $20 a month to watch a whole bunch of different films on a streaming service. So I think this is just the new normal, and Hollywood is very slow at getting on and over trends. They don't want to let things go. Like 10 years ago, it was all vampire and werewolf movies, and now it's all superhero movies. And in 10 years' time, it will be something else. And we have too much reliance on technology and special effects. Bigger isn't always better. And it's interesting what he says, most of which are lesser versions of what worked 20 years ago. So no one can argue that Jurassic Park is a far superior film to all of the Jurassic Worlds. I don't think anyone's going to debate that. Yeah, the technology is better with Jurassic World, but the storytelling was there with Jurassic Park. And, God help us when Scorsese and Spielberg and James Cameron retire, because there's not a lot of young directors that I have a lot of hope that can carry the torch. Studios have too much insight now. They're not creative focused, which, is a good and a bad thing. But Spielberg understood what an audience wanted. He understood what a studio wanted and how to tie both things together. You look at his films, and then they're entertaining from start to finish. I can't help that this movie would have been a lot better and a lot different if he was directing and George Lucas writing. But Indy isn't the only film to have failed this summer. The streaming is undoubtedly a factor. All 4 Indiana Jones' previous adventures are currently available on Disney Plus at the touch of a button. So why buy tickets to see an inferior version? Well, you get to see it on the big screen. You're only going to see it once on the big screen, and it's probably not going to be out for that long before it is gone, unfortunately. And you could see Harrison Ford play Indiana Jones on the big screen one more time. So that's why I would go and see it. And obviously I'm a big Indiana Jones fan. That's why you'd see any film in the cinema, is to experience it out of your living room. You can watch it on Disney Plus when it comes out as much as you like. So besides, so much money and talent is being shoveled into high-profile TV series, and so many A-listers are signing up to appear in them. that films are left looking like the poor relation, which is funny how that's swung back the other way. TV used to be the place where actors went to die, and now it's become more profitable than feature films. It's significant that Britain's biggest film magazine, Empire, has put such Disney Plus TV shows as The Mandalorian, Ahsoka, and Secret Invasion on the front of its covers in recent months, rather than actual cinema releases. Television aside, the WGA writers' strike has stalled numerous productions, including Marvel's Blade and Thunderbolts. And budgets on these films, which are being made, have skyrocketed, largely due to the huge sums spent on visual effects. As Robbie Collin noted in The Telegraph, Fast X cost 10 times as much as the original. The Fast and the Furious and the new Indiana Jones cost more than the previous 4 put together. Wow. No wonder these films struggled to break even. By the end of the summer, said Collin, the preceding 12 months will have seen 4 of the 10 most expensive films ever made. Yeah, incredible. And that's the thing, bigger is not always better. Special effects are good and you can do some cool shit with them, but we don't need every frame of a film filled with special effects, because no one can argue the original Indiana Joneses are better than the 2 newer ones. Raiders of the Lost Ark barely has any visual effects. That was at a time when visual effects was still evolving, but it's all action and stunts, as opposed to the mountains of special effects used in the Dial of Destiny. The COVID-19 pandemic and other global events are factors too. Charles Grant, Screen International's box office editor, tells BBC Culture, cinema's recover from pandemic-blighted 2020 is taking longer than everyone had hoped, says Grant, and it's concerning that in the UK and Ireland, the recovery has essentially stalled, with box office for 2023 so far level with the same period of 2020. China is a worry too. Most Hollywood titles are not performing strongly there, and of course, Russia is missing, and rightfully so. Still, says Grant, we shouldn't read too much into Indy's Duff Weekend. I don't think Hollywood is in crisis because the revival of a franchise didn't do so well. As the last revival of said franchise, let's see what happens with the new Mission Impossible and the Barbie Oppenheimer head-to-head. Then we'll have a clearer picture. I think all those films are going to do pretty well. Could these 3 films be the saviors of cinema this summer? And look, if last year's Top Gun Maverick is anything to go by, I'd say yes. I mean, Spielberg hugged Tom Cruise and said, thank you for saving cinema. That's what Tom Cruise does. He makes films for the cinema, for the audience to go and enjoy. He wants to see these movies succeed. He knows he has to up the ante. He only cares about the audience and how they respond to the film, and not about the shareholders. Disney only gives a fuck about money, and now they're paying the price for it. They've put cash over content, creativity, and quality, and their movies suck. I'm rooting for all 3 of these movies to succeed, because we are definitely in a rising tide lifts all boats phase of the crisis, and it is a crisis, said Harris on Twitter. But the thing is, none of these 3 movies are going to fix the cracks in the hull. However well they do, it's worth noting that Mission Impossible is the 7th installment of a franchise that was itself based on a TV show from 1966, and Barbie is based on a doll brand that was launched in 1959. Neither of them suggest that Hollywood is bursting with creativity and drive. Maybe all this means that the industry is due to have a new Hollywood-style resurgence, as it did in the 1960s, but there's no sign of it yet. And as Harris said, the business cannot go on like this indefinitely. We used to think of the cinema as a dream place. At the moment, it's more like a temple of doom. Love of film and TV. Join BBC Culture, Film and TV. Yeah, interesting. It does say a lot when superhero movies aren't performing very well. And obviously there's a lot of shit that went along behind the scenes with The Flash and its star Ezra Miller. So was there a boycott of The Flash because of Ezra Miller and some of the things he's done? I'm sure that was probably some little part of it. There's probably a hell of a lot more that went into that. It being delayed over budget. I mean, it was supposed to come out years ago and it got shut down for COVID. Then it was supposed to come out during COVID. Then they decided to wait. There's a whole bunch of shit with the special effects team apparently walking off, and that's why the effects didn't look that good, and a whole bunch of other shit. And the director giving away all the surprises in the movie, that also doesn't help. So Mission Impossible will probably do well, and it also suggests that audiences aren't sick of franchises or movies that are in their seventh installment because, like I said, Tom Cruise gives a shit. He's always trying to up the ante, where a lot of these other studios are just concerned about profit. But it is a bit concerning. If you did work at a film studio or you were an executive, you would be pretty worried. These films aren't making the huge amounts of revenue that they used to. And they're costing more, costing 250, 300 million, and they're only making 700 million back, if they're lucky. So it is interesting and concerning. I got a final article from The Hollywood Reporter entitled Indiana Jones Box Office Openings, How the Dial of Destiny Compares to the 4 Previous Movies. It's by Pamela McClintock, July 6, 2023. The fifth and final installment in the famed adventure action series opened to $60.4 million in North America over the June 30 to July 2nd weekend, a troublesome outcome for a movie reportedly costing $290 million. Rewind to summer 1981. In a box office slump, a variety of factors were to blame for the downturn, including rising movie ticket prices and production costs. Sound familiar? But the summer season ended on a high note after Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark rode to the rescue. And that's also something to consider with box office totals, is the tickets are double the price they used to be 20 years ago. Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg, from a story and concept by George Lucas, provided actor Harrison Ford with his own franchise that spanned 2 additional films during the course of the 80s. The trio successfully revived the action-adventure series in 2008's Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, which dug up nearly $800 million at the worldwide box office. But that was another time and place. And that was also in a year that The Dark Knight came out. I think The Dark Knight came out at the end of the month, or in July. So that has some big competition. And there's also a Spider-Man movie released that year as well. That's a pretty decent earning from a franchise that was nearly 30 years old at the time. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, the fifth and final installment in the storied series, opened to an underwhelming $60.4 million at the domestic box office over the June 30, July 2nd weekend. Many films would be pleased with such a sum. One costing a huge $295 million to produce before marketing isn't one of them. The Hollywood Reporter ranks each of the 5 indie movies according to their opening weekends at the domestic box office, when adjusted for inflation from highest to lowest. Surprises could be in store. Number 1, Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, 2008. Indy fans showed up in force to welcome the swashbuckling hero back to the big screen after a 19-year hiatus. Crystal Skull opened with a huge $152 million in North America over the Memorial Day long weekend, including $100 million for the weekend proper. That equals $146.9 million when adjusted for inflation, according to handy calculations provided by Paul Deragbian of ComScore. Crystal Skull received decidedly mixed reviews from critics and audiences alike, but was a box office win on its way to assuming north of $790 million at the worldwide box office for Lucasfilm and Paramount, unadjusted. It was the number 2 film of the year domestically behind The Dark Knight, after beating out the likes of Quantum of Solace, Mamma Mia, and Iron Man. So it was a pretty big year for films. Put another way, Disney's decision to keep the franchise alive after buying Lucasfilm in 2012 and pursue a 5th installment isn't a shock. Number 2, Temple of Doom, 1984. Temple of Doom debuted to $33.9 million domestically, or $106.4 million when adjusted for inflation. According to DeGarbian, Temple of Doom went on to earn $331 million globally, including $179.9 million in North America, unadjusted. For the year, however, it got beat out by Beverly Hills Cop and Ghostbusters. The lasting legacy of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, in terms of box office, is arguably the PG-13 rating. Spielberg advocated for the Motion Picture Association to create the new ratings category between G and R, after parents complained about some of the movie's scenes being too dark. They made similar complaints about the Spielberg executive-produced Gremlins, which opened around the same time. Spielberg's entreaties were heard by the MPA, with PG-13 quickly becoming the go-to rating for Hollywood studios looking to appeal to the widest group of people, whether families or adults looking for some action. Yeah, it's a good point, because there are some pretty dark scenes in that film. Same with Gremlins. I mean, I'm not sure you want your kids watching someone have their heart pulled out before being lowered into a fiery pit. Number 3, The Last Crusade, 1989. The Last Crusade smashed Memorial Day records in North America with 4-day earnings of $37 million. That included $29.4 million for the 3 days, or $77.5 million when adjusted. The threequel was the highest grossing film of 1989 at the global box office with an unadjusted total of $474.2 million, beating Batman. But in North America, Batman prevailed. Can't win them all. Number 4, Dial of Destiny 2023. Did Indiana Jones's luck finally run out? The filmmakers might have been wondering the same thing when the Dial of Destiny opened to $60.4 million over the June-July weekend. A not-so-auspicious start for a tentpole costing $295 million. By way of perspective, Crystal Skull likewise ran over budget, but its price tag was $185 million. It's a huge difference. Dial of Destiny fared even worse overseas, opening to $70 million. The movie was beset with numerous delays, capped by Spielberg's decisions to step aside and turn the franchise over to another director, in this case James Mangold. The news was revealed in February 2020, just before the COVID-19 lockdown, and the intervening years, Indy fans have aged. Those who were 12 when the first movie came out are now 54. Those who were 24 are 66 now. You get the idea. Yet in the post-pandemic, older adults have become all the more discerning in terms of what they will watch in theatres. On opening weekend, the largest segment of the Dial of Destiny's audience, or 23%, was 55 and older. Normally this demo might only make up 5%. Lucasfilm and Disney are hopeful that Dial of Destiny will have legs, particularly among families. It could prove a tough assignment considering that Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 opens July 12, followed a week later by Barbie and Oppenheimer. All three likewise appeal to older adults. If not, the fifth and final Indiana Jones movie could quickly become a box office artifact. Very interesting. It's probably not going to be very good that Mission Impossible opens tomorrow, at least where I am. Every time a Tom Cruise film comes out, it usually does pretty well. And then you've got Barbie, and this hits in the holidays in Australia. And Oppenheimer, obviously, Christopher Nolan, a big historical epic. Probably won't do as good as Barbie, but it will do pretty well. And I saw Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny on the first day it came out, which was a Wednesday. I didn't see the first or second session. I had to go to the third one, unfortunately. I haven't been to a cinema that has been packed in a very long time. I mean, I don't go to on-peak times. I usually go the off-peak time because I don't like the huge crowds and I'm a bit of a loner. I like a couple of people in the cinema. I've been to a few where it's just me, and that does get a little weird. When I saw it, it was the fullest the cinema had been in a while. There was probably about 25 to 35 people, and I'd say that I was probably the youngest by at least 25 to 30 years. There's a lot of older people there. They seem to enjoy it. So I'm not sure this is going to be a film that a lot of young people are going to run out to see. I'm not sure a lot of younger people from this generation have even seen or heard of Indiana Jones. Well, I mean, they probably have, because it's a pretty iconic pop culture reference, but in terms of going to the film, that's a different story. 5. Raiders of the Lost Ark, 1981. The movie opened to $8.3 million from 1,068 theatres over the June 12 to 14 weekend. Emphasis on the location count. In those days, movies still rolled out relatively slowly. When adjusting for inflation, Raiders of the Lost Ark started off with $31.5 million domestically, says, I cannot pronounce this dude's name, says Mr. D. Sorry, I can't pronounce your name. When adjusting for inflation, Raiders of the Lost Ark started off with $31.5 million domestically. The film was an overnight sensation, amassing more than $212 million in its original run at the North American box office, and $248.2 million including re-releases. When adjusted for inflation, that translates to at least a franchise best $940 million. Yeah, interesting. Globally, Raiders of the Lost Ark was the biggest film of 1981 with $354 million in worldwide ticket sales, beating On Golden Pond and Superman 2. If ever a movie had legs, it was Raiders of the Lost Ark, which fell to number 2 in its sophomore outing when the Superman sequel opened. Not to worry, Spielberg's pick only dropped a scant 8% in its second weekend before climbing back up the chart to number 1. In its sixth weekend, all told, Raiders spent 42 weeks in the top 10. That, folks, is how a Hollywood franchise is born. So going back to the script, I heard that apparently Phoebe Waller-Bridge had something to do with the scripting of the Dial of Destiny. Apparently she put forth a couple of ideas to James Mangold. He liked them and agreed to change a few things. Which brings up the question is what makes her so fucking special? Because she's been brought in to write things or quote-unquote upgrade scripts before with No Time to Die. I know she's a writer and she's written Fleabag and Killing Eve and shit like that, but Indiana Jones seems a bit out of her wheelhouse, and I get the sense that Kathleen Kennedy isn't the only one responsible for some of the feminist angles in this film. Not that it's huge or anything, it's just still annoying and it's just not necessary for this film or the franchise. Apparently her and Mangold's big genius suggestion for the script was Indy complaining that he wanted to die, and of course she would want this to happen so she can pick up the hat and the whip and carry on his adventures in a spin-off TV show or movie. Why does Waller-Bridges have so much power? I don't particularly think she's that talented. I've only seen a few of her films and I don't think she's that good of an actress. There's nothing that made me think that she was vital to that role, and another actress couldn't have played the part. I mean, Margot Robbie would have been much better. Anyone could have played Helena Shaw and done a much better and much more convincing job. I mean, Emily Blunt would have been another choice. So why does Waller-Bridges have so much power? Or Waller-Bridge, whatever the fuck her name is. And you think Lucasfilm and Disney would have learnt their lesson from Solo? She played that arrogant and annoying pansexual droid that no one fucking liked. So why bring her on to write or give creative story suggestions when her history isn't that good? And I'm pretty sure some of the revisions she had to the No Time to Die script were pretty unnecessary, trying to make Bond less chauvinistic and make the very annoying character played by Lysandra Lynch more relevant. Why were her ideas included, and why didn't James Mangold show a spine and counter these ideas? I mean, he is directing the film. He has been entrusted to direct the fifth and final film in the series. He should have had a bit more spine and stood up to the studios and her a bit more. And that concludes my epic review of Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I hope you all enjoyed it and it didn't spoil it too much. Like I said before, I've got a thing for details. Just before we get out of here, I have a quick message from the Cheers Big Ears podcast.
G'day. Don't skip. Let me interrupt the podcast that you're currently listening to with some blatant self-promotion. What do you get when you mix two Aussie mates, a splash of booze, well, more than a splash, and some microphones? You get Cheers Big Ears, hosted by myself, the Chad, and my mate, Matt, and sometimes, but more often than not now, my missus, Bobby. It's a podcast of adult beverages and not-so-adult conversation. It's not serious, far from it. Well, except for that one episode, but that was just that one. We're available wherever you get your podcast fix. Cheers, Big Ears.
Definitely check out the Cheers Big Ears podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, and help support my homeboys, Chad and Matt. Give them a follow and like on Facebook and Instagram. You can find the show wherever you get your podcasts from. It's fastly becoming one of my favourite podcasts. I listen to it every week. It's funny as fuck, so definitely check it out. If you'd like to support True Tank, there's a couple of things you can do. Head on over to the Facebook and Instagram page, give them a follow and a like. Download your favourite episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Google, Amazon, Podbean, or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Head on over to the Truth Tank YouTube channel and give it a follow. If you feel so inclined, you can leave a review on the show. It helps the show grow and get found. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell anyone you think might like the show. Help spread the word and get it out there. Until next time, I'm a Tank. This is the truth. May the truth be with you.
Instalment.